Hi, I'm Alex Pault, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Talking Timepieces, where we discuss watch collecting and horology. Today, I wanted to expand on some of my comments that I had made about Rolexes and put it into context with the watch collecting and the concept that there's such a thing as an alternative to Rolex. Now, I've often said that Rolexes really aren't for watch collectors, although there are collectible Rolexes like the Explorer 2. It's one of the few that have successfully managed to avoid the hype and the hyperinflation of value, even though it has the same movement in case as the GMT Master. So it demonstrates that Rolex is also a cult of personality, because the true Rolex aficionados don't really care a lot about the technology. They care more about the design, the presentation. Well, I shouldn't bin them all in that aspect, but the whole part of Rolex being a phenomena in and of itself, it's a hyper brand. So if you collect Rolexes, you're collecting a hyper brand. So there really isn't a comparison. It's like saying, yeah, you know, that Ferrari is nice, but I'm a Koenigsegg owner. At the car level, that's a little higher. I would call Rolex actually more of a BMW, but BMW punches far above its weight. It's got some beautiful cars, and even their low-level cars are considered a little bit high-end. The 318, 320 BMWs are very good cars. So I would actually, in a relationship of that nature, I would equate Rolex to a BMW or another mainstream but highly regarded product. But in the case of Rolex, they've actually broken free of that and are what I call a hyper brand. They've managed to transcend the entire industry in a way that only a few manufacturers have been able to accomplish. And most of the manufacturers that have been able to accomplish this immense task, that I have to give total kudos to the ghost of Hans Wilsdorf and the legacy that he created in Rolex. You have to give him credit, because he had the vision. He called it for wristwatches at the turn of the last century, did everything he could to create a good product for people. And the brand has successfully survived everything thrown at it and has risen above it all to be a hyper brand in the area of watchmaking. You could go to Calcutta. You could go to anywhere. You could go to a back street in some little known place in Mongolia, and odds are that person, any person you ask, is going to know McDonald's, they're going to know Rolex, and maybe Coca-Cola. All right? When you think about the brands that are identifiable worldwide, no matter who you talk to, it's a short list. I would say between 5 and 10 brands that you could literally say are hyper brands that are around the entire world and that reflect the power of the legacy of that brand. In the case of, say, for example, Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola has a lot of criticism, and yet they are worldwide and accepted. Ditto for McDonald's. Now, Rolex has managed to do it without being a mass market, lowest common denominator brand, and I have to give them kudos for that. I mean, that is an achievement that no one has managed to do. There is no other high-end product with the complete brand awareness. I mean, even the biggest brands in the high-end area, Lacoste, Dolce & Gabbana, Louis Vuitton, those are all world-class products, but they don't have world-class recognition. I mean, they have recognition within certain areas, but in the case of worldwide recognition, the only major brand that I could think of that is not a consumer mainstream product is Rolex, which brings me to my point that there is no such thing as an alternative to Rolex, because even though I say Rolexes are not for watch collectors in general, the fact is that there isn't any alternative to them either. And the reason I say that is because since Rolex has established its mark, as it were. It's impossible for another company to emulate them without looking like they are copying them. So, for example, the Rolex came out with the Oyster, first waterproof watch, wristwatch. It wasn't the first waterproof watch, period. It was the first waterproof wristwatch. But since his was the first, he could give it a cool name. Oyster, hard case, waterproof, beautiful name, great branding. Then the self-winding movement becomes the Oyster Perpetual. Perpetual, great name, fantastic branding. Hans Wilsdorf was a genius. Now, because his designs were so clean and simple, and his functions were so basic and necessary, needed, the Datejust, his brands not only became beloved by the tool-using watch public, because of this strong base of trust and expectation of quality, Rolex managed to successfully navigate the quartz crisis. Almost stumbled with the Oyster quartz, but even the Oyster quartz is selling for like $4,000 now as a used watch. It's considered the least expensive of the Rolexes to acquire, but it's a sign of how powerful the brand is that even the snobbier collectors would still get a quartz Rolex. So when I say that there's no such thing as a Rolex alternative, it's more that they've established their brand so strongly in the marketplace that if you're not wearing a Rolex, you're simply just not wearing a Rolex. No one's going to look at this Omega Globemaster annual calendar, which is a phenomenal watch, and I believe in a lot of ways superior to anything Rolex has got outside of the Sky Dweller, but it's not a Rolex. It's lost 30% of its value the day I bought it, and it's not going to pick up much of it in the future. But it's a beautiful piece. I'm glad I have it, but I didn't buy it instead of a Rolex. I bought it because it's a nice watch. Now, that's the whole aspect of the concept of a Rolex alternative is, don't think of it as a Rolex alternative. Think of it as another watch in your collection, because if you focus on watches as being an alternative to Rolex, then you'll always be measuring them against Rolex, and they will fall short, because no matter how fancy these watches are or how beautiful their complications are or how well made they are, they're not Rolexes, and they will never get the attention and the buff, the sheen of attention that a Rolex gets. Now, in the case of the non-popular Rolexes, like, say, for example, the Explorer 2, they're actually liked by people because they're Rolexes, but they don't look like Rolexes. So you get to have a Rolex without being seen as pretentious. But the bottom line is most people buy a Rolex to get attention. Most people buy the Rolex because they want people to see that they have a Rolex, because that's a symbol of success, or it's a milestone for something in their lives. They had a child or they got married, because Rolex has managed to become an aspirational purchase, like in the way of an engagement ring. It is expected that a Rolex has some kind of weight behind it beyond the value of the watch itself. And it's that intangible plus, this hyper brand aspect of the marketplace, that means that anything else is just not a Rolex. So to sum it all up, I just wanted to say is I have a tremendous respect for Rolex. I own a Rolex. I used to own 4 Rolexes. I literally sold most of them because I got tired of the way Rolex treated its ownership. But a lot of that can be laid at the foot of the ADs, and some of it can be laid at the foot of Rolex management. But the bottom line is they can get away with it because they make a good product. They've stood behind it for over a century. And if you buy a Rolex, you're going to be ensured of getting a quality product. And everybody on the planet knows what it is. So you could walk into that bar in Zimbabwe and someone will look at your wrist and just go, hey, nice Rolex. So there is no such thing as an alternative to Rolex, but I'm not saying that only buy Rolex. What I'm saying is don't try to replace a Rolex. Buy watches you like and If you can afford a Rolex, get one. If you want a Rolex, get one. But this constant comparison to everything to Rolex is counterproductive and unhealthy, frankly. I mean, can't we just recognize that Rolexes are a hyper brand at the upper end of the luxury market that happens to be tangential to ours as watch collectors, I can respect a Rolex. I don't see a Submariner as high horology, but I do see it as a very well made, impeccably finished, high value, durable, functional, waterproof, rugged watch that also looks good. So it's not to put Rolex down to say that Rolexes aren't for collectors. It's more to say Rolex is a different breed. Rolex has its own identity. It's a hyper brand. It exists on a plane that these other brands can't compete with. That's why Rolex is trying so hard to make Tudor something, because Tudor is now, in my mind, what Rolex used to be. Good quality tool watches for people who want something reliable that they're going to enjoy and get a lot of mileage out of at a reasonable price point. Everything in the Tudor stable is a great watch. But again, it lives under the shadow of Rolex. So I guess what I'm trying to say is stop trying to compare everything to Rolex. Just accept that Rolex is its own brand, and let's just live our lives and collect cool watches outside of that influence and just smile and nod as we go by and tip the hat and say, good for you. And enjoy watch collecting as it should be, and not as a one-upmanship contest to see who can get the most closest Rolex wannabe watch, or who can get their hands on the Hulk or whatever, because that's more of a branding and image chase as opposed to, look at this cool Marie Lacroix annual calendar chronograph flyback, right? Cost a third of what a Rolex costs. Not a Rolex, it's a nice watch. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and let's think about, why are we collecting watches and what a brand like Rolex represents to the industry. Frankly, I think Rolex is good for the industry because the fact that one of the hyper brands in the world is a watch reminds us all that watches are still cool. So those are my 2 cents. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have any ideas or something I could talk about next, love to hear it. Thanks a lot and have a great day. And hey, please subscribe. It's a hobby channel. I only post intermittently, but if you do subscribe, it's good for me, and you'll know when I have something new. So you have a great day, and thanks for taking the time to listen to me.